The Suevi, then Suebi, and in the 6th century also Suevi, were a large group of people who lived in Germania and were first mentioned by Julius Caesar in connection with Ariovistus, a campaign in Gaul, 58 BC. While Caesar treated them as one Germanic tribe, though the largest and most warlike, later authors such as Tacitus, Pliny and Strabo specified that the Suevi do not, like the Chatti or Tencteri, constitute a single nation. They actually occupy more than half of Germany, and are divided into a number of distinct tribes under distinct names, though all generally are called Suebi. At one time, classical ethnography had applied the name Suevi to so many Germanic tribes that it appeared as though in the 1st centuries AD, this native name would replace the foreign name Germans. Classical authors noted that the Suevic tribes, compared to other Germanic tribes, were very mobile, and not reliant upon agriculture. Various Suevic groups moved from the direction of the Baltic Sea and River Elbe, becoming a periodic threat to the Roman Empire on their Rhine and Danube frontiers. Toward the end of the empire, the Alemanni, also referred to as Suebi, first settled in the Agridecomates and then crossed the Rhine and occupied Alsace. A pocket remained in the region now still called Swabia, an area in southwest Germany whose modern name derives from the Suebi. Others moved as far as Galaretia and established a Suebic kingdom of Galaretia there, which lasted for 170 years until its integration into the Visigothic kingdom. The Suebi may not have been identical to the Suevi living in the Scheldt area in the 6th and 7th centuries, who are supposed to have given their name to the Dutch province of Zeeland. Etymology. Etymologists trace the name from Proto-Germanic *Suebis, either based on the Proto-Germanic root *swe, meaning one's own people, or on the third-person reflexive pronoun, or from an earlier Indo-European root *swe. The etymological sources list the following ethnic names as also from the same root: Suenus, Semnonus, Samnites, Sabelli, Sabini, indicating the possibility of a prior more extended and common Indo-European ethnic name, our own people. Alternatively, it may be borrowed from a Celtic word for vagabond. Classification. More than one tribe. Caesar placed the Suebi east of the Ubi, apparently near modern Hesse, in the position where later writers mention the Chatti, and he distinguished them from their allies the Marcomanni. Some commentators believe that Caesar's Suebi were the later Chatti or possibly the Hermundari, or even the Semnonus. Later authors use the term Suebi more broadly, to cover a large number of tribes in central Germany. Although no classical authors explicitly call the Chatti Suevic, Pliny the Elder reported in his Natural History that the Hermiones were a large grouping of related Germanic gentes or tribes, including not only the Suebi, but also the Hermundari, Chatti and Cherish. Whether or not the Chatti were ever considered Suevi, both Tacitus and Strabo distinguish the two, partly because the Chatti were more settled in one territory, whereas Suevi remained less settled. The definitions of the greater ethnic groupings within Germania were apparently not always consistent and clear, especially in the case of mobile groups such as the Suevi, whereas Tacitus reported three main kinds of German peoples: Hermiones, Istvi ones, and Ingvar ones. Pliny specifically adds two more genera or kinds, the Basternare and the Vandili. The Vandili were tribes east of the Elbe, including the well-known Silingi, Goths, and Burgundians, an area which Tacitus treated as Suebic. That the Vandals might be a separate type of Germanic people is a possibility Tacitus noted also. But for example the Varini are named as Vandilic by Pliny, and specifically Suebic by Tacitus. Also the modern term, Elbe Germanic, covers a large grouping of Germanic peoples that at least overlaps with the classical terms, Suevi, and Hermiones. However, this term was developed mainly as an attempt to define the ancient peoples who must have spoken the Germanic dialects that led to modern, Upper German dialects spoken in Austria. Bavaria, Thuringia, Alsace, Baden-Württemberg and German-speaking Switzerland. This was proposed by Friedrich Maurer as one of 5 major Kulturkreise or culture groups, whose dialects developed in the southern German area from the 1st century BC through to the 4th century AD. Apart from his own linguistic work with modern dialects, he also referred to the archaeological and literary analysis of Germanic tribes done earlier by Gustav Cassiner in terms of these proposed ancient dialects. The Vandals, Goths and Burgundians are generally referred to as members of an Eastern Germanic group, distinct from the Elbe Germanic tribes' names in classical sources. Northern bank of the Danube. In the time of Caesar, southern Germany was Celtic, but coming under pressure from Germanic groups led by the Suebi. As described later by Tacitus, what is today southern Germany between the Danube, the main river, and the Rhine had been deserted by the departure of 2 large Celtic nations, the Helvetii in modern Schwaben and the Boier further east near the Hercynian forest. In addition, also near the Hercynian forest, Caesar believed that the Celtic Tectosages had once lived. All of these peoples had for the most part moved by the time of Tacitus. Strabo, in Book IV of his geography, also associates the Suebi with the Hercynian forest and the south of Germania north of the Danube. He describes a chain of mountains north of the Danube that is like a lower extension of the Alps, possibly the Swabian Alps, and further east the Gabretta forest, possibly the modern Bohemian forest. In Book 7 Strabo specifically mentions as Slavic peoples the Marcomanni, who under King Maroboduus had moved into the same Hercynian forest as the Koldui, taking over an area called Boemum. This king took the rulership and acquired, in addition to the peoples aforementioned, the Lugi, the Zumi, the Butones, the Mugilones, the Sabini, and also the Semnones, a large tribe of the Sueva themselves. Some of these tribes were inside the forest, and some outside of it. Tacitus confirms the name Boemum, saying it was a survival marking the old traditional population of the place, the Celtic Boier. Though the population had changed, Tacitus describes a series of very powerful Suebian states in his own time, running along the north of the Danube, which was the frontier with Rome, and stretching into the lands where the Elbe originates in the modern-day Czech Republic. Going from west to east, the first were the Humunderi, living near the sources of the Elbe and stretching across the Danube into Roman Rhaetia. Next came the Neristi, the Marcomanni, and then the Quadi. The Quadi are on the edge of Greater Suebia, having the Sarmatians to the southeast. Claudius Ptolemy the geographer did not always state which tribes were Suebi, but along the northern bank of the Danube, from west to east and starting at the desert formerly occupied by the Helvetii, he names the Parmarcampi, then the Adrabacampi, and then a large people known as the Bimoi, and then the Rakatrii. North of the Bimoi is the Luna forest, which has iron mines, and which is south of the Quadi. North of the Adrabacampi are the Sudani and then the Marcomanni living in the Gambretta forest. North of them, but south of the Sudetes mountains are the Varisti, who are probably the same as Tacitus' Neristi, mentioned above. Jordanes writes that in the early 4th century the Vandals had moved to the north of the Danube, but with the Marcomanni still to their west, and the Humunderi still to their north. A possible sign of confusion in this comment is that he equates the area in question to later Gepidia, which was further south, in Pannonia, modern Hungary, and east of the Danube. In general, as discussed below, the Danubian Suebi, along with their neighbors such as the Vandals, apparently moved southwards into Roman territories, both south and east of the Danube, during this period. Approaching the Rhine, Caesar describes the Suebi as pressing the German tribes of the Rhine, such as the Tencteri, Usipetes and Ubii, from the east, forcing them from their homes. While emphasizing their warlike nature, he writes as if they had a settled homeland somewhere between the Cherish and the Ubii, and separated from the Cherch by a deep forest called the Silver Bassenis. He also describes the Marcomanni as a tribe distinct from the Suebi, and also active within the same alliance, but he does not describe where they were living. Strabo wrote that the Suebi excel all the others in power and numbers. He describes Suebic peoples as having come to dominate Germany between the Rhine and Elbe, with the exception of the Rhine Valley, on the frontier with the Roman Empire, and the coastal regions north of the Rhine. The geographer, Ptolemy, in a fairly extensive account of Greater Germany, makes several unusual mentions of Suebi between the Rhine and the Elbe. He describes their position as stretching out in a band from the Elbe, all the way to the northern Rhine, near the Sugambray. The Suevi Langobardi are the Suevi located closest to the Rhine, far to the east of where most sources report them. To the east of the Langobardi are the Suevi Angeli, extending as far north as the Middle Elbe, also to the east of the position reported in other sources. It has been speculated that Ptolemy may have been confused by his sources, or else that this position of the Langobardi represented a particular moment in history. As discussed below, in the 3rd century a large group of Suebi, also referred to as the Alemanni, moved up to the Rhine bank in modern Schwaben, which had previously been controlled by the Romans. The Elbe Strabo does not say much about the Suebi east of the Elbe, saying that this region was still unknown to Romans, but mentions that a part of the Suebi live there, naming only specifically the Hermundari and the Langobardi. But he mentions these are there because of recent defeats at Roman hands which had forced them over the river. In any case, he says that the area near the Elbe itself is held by the Suebi. From Tacitus and Ptolemy we can derive more details. The Senones are described by Tacitus as the oldest and noblest of the Suebi. Unlike the Suebi described by Caesar, they have 100 cantons. Tacitus says that the vastness of their community makes them regard themselves as the head of the Suevic race. According to Ptolemy, the Suevi Senones live upon the Elbe and stretch as far east as a river apparently named after them, the Suevis, probably the Oder. South of them he places the Silingi, and then, again upon the Elbe, the Calucones. To the southeast, further up the upper Elbe, he places not the Hermundari mentioned by other authors, but the Benokima. The Langobardi live a bit further from Rome's borders, in scanty numbers but surrounded by a host of most powerful tribes, and kept safe by daring the perils of war, according to Tacitus. Tacitus names 7 tribes who live next, after the Langobardi, fenced in by rivers or forests, stretching into the remoter regions of Germany. These all worshipped Nether, or Mother Earth, whose sacred grove was on an island in the ocean. Reudigni, Avionus, Anglii, Verini, Eudoses, Swarini and Newtones. At the mouth of the Elbe, the classical authors do not place any Suevi, but rather the Chaucer to the west of the Elbe, and the Saxons to the east, and in the neck of peninsula. Note that while various errors and confusions are possible, Ptolemy places the Angles and Langobardi west of the Elbe, where they may indeed have been present at some points in time, given that the Suebi were often mobile. East of the Elbe it is already mentioned above, thus stretching between the Elbe and the Oder. The classical authors place the Suebic Semnones. Ptolemy places the Silingi to their south in the stretch between these rivers. These Silingi appear in later history as a branch of the Vandali, and were therefore likely to be speakers of East Germanic dialects. Their name is associated with medieval Silesia. Further south on the Elbe the Benokima, and between them and the Askibergian mountains Ptolemy names a tribe called the Batini, apparently northern, or east of the Elbe. According to Tacitus, around the north of the Danubian Marcomanni and Quadi, dwelling in forests and on mountain tops, live the Marcina and Buri, who, in their language and manner of life, resemble the Suevi. Ptolemy also places the Nugiburi in mountains, along with a tribe called the Korkonta. These mountains, stretching from near the upper Elbe to the headwaters of the Vistula, he calls the Askibergian Mountains. Between these mountains and the Quadi he had several tribes. From north to south these are the Sidonese, Cotini and the Visburgi. There is then the Orcinian forest, which Ptolemy defines with relatively restricted boundaries, and then the Quadi. Beyond this mountain range where the Marsina and Buri live, in the area of modern southwest Poland, Tacitus reported a multitude of tribes, the most widespread name of which was the Lugi. These included the Harii, Helvecani, Minima, Helesii and Nahavali. As mentioned above, Ptolemy categorizes the Buri amongst the Lugi, and concerning the Lugi north of the mountains, he named two large groups, the Lugoi-Omanoi and the Lugoi-Didaunoi, who lived between the Suevis River and the Vistula, south of the Burgundy. These Burgundians, who according to Ptolemy lived between the Baltic Sea Germans and the Lugi, stretching between the Suevis and Vistula rivers, were described by Pliny the Elder as being not Suevic but Vandili, amongst whom he also included the Goths and the Verini, both being people living north of them near the Baltic coast. Pliny's Vandili are generally thought to be speakers of what modern linguists refer to as Eastern Germanic. Between the coastal Saxons and inland Suebi, Ptolemy names the Teutoneri and the Virioni, and further east, between the coastal Faradini and the Suebi are the Teutones and then the Ivana. Further east again, between the Burgundians and the coastal Rugiculi were the Aelva ones. Baltic Sea Tacitus called the Baltic Sea the Suebian Sea. Beyond the Danish Isles are the farthest people of Germania, the Hermionus, north of the Lugi. Near the Baltic Sea Tacitus places the Gothonus, Rugi, and Lemuvii. These three Germanic tribes share a tradition of having kings, and also similar arms, round shields and short swords. Ptolemy says that east of the Saxons, from the Chalusis River to the Suvian River of the Faradini, then the Sidini up to the Viadua River, and after these the Rugiculi, up to the Vistula River. He does not specify if these are Suva. In the sea, the states of the Suenus, powerful in ships, are according to Tacitus Germans with the Suevic Sea on one side and an almost motionless sea on the other more remote side. Modern commentators believe this refers to Scandinavia. Closely bordering on the Suenus and closely resembling them are the tribes of the Citones. Ptolemy describes Scandinavia as being inhabited by Chedini in the west, Favani and Pheresi in the east, Finni in the north, Gauta and Dotianus in the south, and Livoni in the middle. He does not describe them as Suebi. Tacitus describes the non-Germanic Asthi on the eastern shore of the Suevic Sea, whose rites and fashions and style of dress are those of the Suva, while their language is more like the British. After giving this account, Tacitus says, "Here Suebia ends." Therefore, for Tacitus, geographic Suebia comprises the entire periphery of the Baltic Sea, including within it tribes not identified as Suebi or even Germanic. On the other hand, Tacitus does clearly consider there to be not only a Suebian region, but also Suebian languages, and Suebian customs, which all contribute to making a specific tribe more or less Suebian. Cultural characteristics. Caesar noted that rather than grain crops, they spent time on husbandry and hunting. They wore animal skins, bathed in rivers, consumed milk and meat products, and prohibited wine, allowing trade only to dispose of their booty, and otherwise they had no goods to export. They had no private ownership of land and were not permitted to stay resident in one place for more than 1 year. They were divided into 100 cantons, each of which had to provide and support 1,000 armed men for the constant pursuit of war. Strabo describes the Suebian people from their part of the world as highly mobile and nomadic. Unlike more settled and agricultural tribes such as the Cheti and Cherish, they do not till the soil or even store up food, but live in small huts that are merely temporary structures, and they live for the most part off their flocks, as the nomads do, so that, in imitation of the nomads, they load their household belongings on their wagons and with their beasts turn whithersoever they think best. Notable in classical sources, the Suebi can be identified by their hairstyle called the Suebian knot, which distinguishes the freeman from the slave, or in other words served as a badge of social rank. The same passage points out that chiefs use an even more elaborate style. Tacitus mentions the sacrifice of humans practiced by the Semnonis in a sacred grove and the murder of slaves used in the rites of Nearthus practiced by the tribes of Schleswig-Holstein. The chief priest of the Nahavali dresses as a woman, and that tribe also worships in groves. The Harii fight at night dyed black. The Suenos own fleets of rowing vessels with prows at both ends.